As human beings, our experience of the world is mediated through our 5 explicit senses, through our sense of sight, our hearing, our smell, our taste, and our touch. We receive sense impressions from the world. The organs of sense communicate those impressions by electrical signals to the brain that reconstructs everything that we perceive around us. But is that all that there is to sensation? Are the only things out there that can be sensed what can be sensed by seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching? Are there forms of extrasensory perception? Or, as well, are there times where we might be sensing certain things, but the phenomena that we are sensing are beyond our expectations and what is understood according to scientific materialism, what is called the paranormal? Today, let us consider what might be going on with extrasensory perception, what we should think about it as Christians, and how we can move forward. We do well to make sure we understand one another and we define our terms. At the broadest levels, extrasensory perception would be any kind of sense impression given which did not originate from our senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, or touch. Thus, it is perception that is extra or beyond our senses. A lot of the forms of extrasensory perception that we can think of are often called intuitions. These are forms of knowledge acquired or ascertained without recourse to reasoning or explanation. So this would perhaps be gut feelings, or for some reason you just feel off, or suddenly a situation feels weird, or you walk into a situation that feels weird and you can't exactly put your finger on it. Any kind of knowledge that you're getting that you're not sensing with the 5 senses or is going through some kind of inductive, deductive, rational analysis would fall under that realm of intuition. People who consider themselves able to come to understanding of other people or things because of the use of things beyond sensory perception, so using extrasensory perception, are known as clairvoyants. There are some who allege the ability to communicate with others with the mind without using any other form of explicit communication. That would be known as telepathy. When we speak of being able to relate to the feelings of others, we're using this term very often now. We talk of empathy, right? Empathy, we normally talk about in terms of being able to feel for others. But there is a domain of empathy, which you could almost consider clairvoyant empathy, where somebody is saying they're actually feeling the same feeling as others, that it's a kind of a mutual experience in a way much more profound than the standard use of the idea of empathy. There's also the idea of precognition, retrocognition, and second sense. Precognition would be the idea of knowing something before it happens. Retrocognition would say that you are able to know something, it has happened or is going on, but you have no direct sensory access or source of information from that thing. So if you think something's going on across the world, perhaps the most common illustration of this phenomenon is this is all of a sudden sense that someone has just passed, even though you have no real ability to know that, and then later on you get the information that they passed at the exact time that you had that feeling. That would be a sense of retrocognition. There are some who also claim the ability to understand something, to be able to touch something, understand things about it based on sensing its aura or its energies. That is known as telemetry. And so those are all the kinds of forms of extrasensory perception that are normally talked about or alleged to exist. And we consider our sense impressions from our seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching so compelling and so dominant that they're normal. And so anything that we would sense beyond those things would be paranormal or beyond normal. Likewise, we've privileged those sense impressions to the point where if we think about somebody who is having sensory input not from those 5 senses, the term for that is psychic. I know the way psychic is used in culture and all the ways it is used, but the idea of psychic is just someone who is discerning something by the psyche, the life force, not through hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, or smelling. So it's interesting how these terms have this very broad definition. We've used them in very specific, narrow things, but it really shows just how much we privilege our sense of the 5 senses and what we receive from them. So we've looked primarily here at extrasensory perception. So these are things that exist in the world, perhaps in the creation, but we're not directly sensing them with the five senses. We're sensing them some other way. There's also what we call paranormal phenomena, in which we are seeing or hearing, maybe smelling, possibly touching or tasting, but we are using our five senses. But what our five senses are telling us are things that cannot be explained through standard scientific protocols. These would be involved like claims of seeing ghosts or receiving messages from the dead, mediums saying they can communicate with the dead. The belief in and use of magic would also be considered paranormal because, yeah, the result, even the process, can be perceived, but they involve matters that cannot be explained by scientific processes. And anything involving the spiritual dimension would be reckoned as paranormal, and there might be ways in which it involves extrasensory perception or sensing paranormal phenomena. So a lot of this we think about, a lot of times you say, oh, it's all hooey. And that's what a lot of people have done. So we can understand the world of scientific materialism, that is so something that is very prevalent today. And if you are committed to scientific materialism, then yeah, by definition, you're going to be very skeptical and hostile toward the idea of extrasensory perception. Because according to scientific materialism, everything has some kind of existence. Therefore, what exists is what you can perceive. And things that are beyond our perception, therefore, you would not say exist because you cannot perceive them. This is the kind of superstition tomfoolery that if you are a scientific materialist, you would hope that we had evolved beyond after the past 250 years. But even a lot of people who profess Jesus will likewise have complete disregard and even derision and mockery for any of the things that we have mentioned because they have maintained a strong commitment to rationalism or a fundamentalist rejection of anything that is difficult to explain. Now, there are a lot of important reasons to be skeptical about a lot of the claims involving both extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena. On the other hand, we should be careful about dogmatically insisting that we have firm, full understanding of exactly how things work around us and that we are able to completely out of hand dismiss anything beyond it. As we've seen, our sense impressions of the world, the way we look at the world, is all mediated by those five senses and how our brain reconstructs what those five senses tell it. How can we maintain full confidence that that's all that can be perceived out there, all that can be sensed out there? That would require us to be very confident that we know what we do not know, and that very rarely goes well for us human beings. Can we imagine how we would experience some kind of phenomena? If there's a phenomena out there that we can experience, we aren't going to do it from our five senses. What would that experience be like? It's probably going to seem a little weird. It's going to seem a little confused, a little incoherent, maybe muddled. There you go. And what about phenomena that would be out there that we are perceiving with our senses but is paranormal? That also would probably seem muddled, incoherent, imprecise, and of course is at variance with our current commitment to scientific materialism and that framework that so many are using today. If we are Christians, if we believe that there is a God, and we believe that God exists in the realm that we call the spiritual realm, i.e. heaven, we are already committed to the reality that there is paranormal phenomena out there, because the spiritual realm would be paranormal. It's beyond the normal of what we generally perceive. And that if there is a God beyond us, there might be forms of perception that go beyond the five senses, simply because that would be something that is on the realm of God or some other realm that we don't understand. A good time to remember that what we understand we do because God has informed us or because it is apparent to our eyes. That there's all kinds of secret things that belong to God, and His ways are higher than our ways in Deuteronomy 29:29, Isaiah 55:8 and 9. So we need to be careful about being dogmatic about these things. We need to be humble in considering extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena, and entrust ourselves to God, who does have a lot better understanding of all of these things. So let's look at some of these things we've talked about and to understand them all in a greater depth. And what's interesting is we see that there's going to be a persistent, consistent theme throughout. With intuition is going to be the form that you are going to most likely identify with, because we've probably all had a gut feeling, right? Some moment we just had this gut feeling and there's no way to explain it according to any rational way of thinking. Maybe we had a voice in our head that told us to do something or not to do something. Maybe we just had a strong feeling we should or should not go into a certain context, and it it led to a very important outcome for us. Maybe not for us, maybe something that somebody else that we trust had that experience and talked to us about it. Now, ironically, of all the forms of extrasensory perception we've talked about, intuition might well and often really involve perception of our five senses. When we look at our five senses, there are ways in which the brain is filtering out the data it's receiving. Not everything that your eyes are bringing in are being actively processed by the brain. Not every vibration that's entering your ear is being actively processed by the brain in a conscious way. There are ways that perhaps subconsciously and unconsciously we're perceiving things that we are noting, and the noting of that is what we feel by intuition. And so we're really perceiving it, it's just not exactly the same way as we're used to using our senses. It also might be instinctual, that we have certain experiences, certain things that we've learned or ingrained within us that we have the very visceral reaction that's really instinctual. So that might be also what's going on. So at least some of what we think are intuitive sensations are really aspects of the environment we have just processed, just subconsciously, or involve our intuition. But again, who can dogmatically say that anything we deal with that's in the intuitive is just coming out of subconscious sense impressions or from instinct? There's a lot made of auras and energies. In New Age circles especially, we'll talk more about that. But who can have complete confidence that there's nothing to that at all, and that we actually might be sensitive to those things, and that might be part of our intuition? Christians are committed to the existence of the spiritual realm. We again are going to keep going back to this. And if that's the case, there's also the promise in Scripture that the Spirit of God will be active in the life of the believer, that He is a down payment of our salvation in 2 Corinthians 5:11 and Ephesians 1 and verse 13. Can any of us declare with any dogmatism and be on firm ground to say exactly how that Spirit might prompt us, in what ways that might take place? Can we really have confidence that every thought that ever has entered our brain is just from our conscious, subconscious, or unconscious? Perhaps is it the Spirit of God prompting us? Perhaps is it the way the evil one is tempting us? Would not our brains be that locus where there would be spiritual warfare going on, like in Ephesians chapter 6? So we should be open in matters of intuition. Why would we automatically prove critical and skeptical of a gut feeling if we're not as critical and skeptical about how we perceive otherwise? And if what we think of as intuition is really subconscious sensory perception, instinct, or signals from the body anyway, why would we want to suppress them? We should take them seriously, right? Has God at any point told us that the only thing that we should accept is true or real, what our brain is consciously processing? Or in fact, has He warned us to be careful about that we walk by faith and not by sight? 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. So we should be open to intuition really telling us things that we just aren't perceiving fully with the other senses. But being open doesn't mean uncritically accepting of it, because our sense impressions fail sometimes, our intuitions can fail us sometimes. The Spirit of God might prompt us, the evil's spirit, the evil one and his demons might be prompting us as well. When it comes to the rest of the others, we look at telepathy and empathy and clairvoyance there, as well as perhaps looking at precognition, retrocognition, and second sight. And all of these things, we do well to be rather skeptical of these things, because we're really bad at memory in general. We're very bad at knowing what somebody's thinking, knowing what somebody's feeling. Our memory is very often imprecise and can be very easily prompted at times. Just because we're skeptical doesn't mean that we should be completely closed to any sort of that kind of situation. When it comes to telepathy or empathy, especially with deep relationships, there might be times at which people are basically thinking the same thoughts or feeling the same feelings. There's some really interesting work going on with perhaps especially twins, identical twins, that there's some very deep, profound connections between them that might go much deeper than what we can understand. Also, when you're in a very deep, loving relationship with somebody, finishing one of their sentences or just kind of being able to get a sense of where they're feeling just from where they are. Now, again, that all might just be all kinds of subconscious things going on that we're perceiving. It might be just instinctual and kind of learning people. But there also might be something beyond that. We also need to do well to give space to the working of God and His Spirit. Because the way that God works among us is through His people. That's one of the things God does. You see that in Acts 10. How many things were done so that Peter got in front of Cornelius? God works through people. Is there ever a situation where out of nowhere we just thought about somebody? Or all of a sudden we got a phone call from somebody who's thinking of us, and it was a very important call, very important message for them or for us. Is that merely coincidental? Is it just happened that somebody spoke the right word at the right time in our lives? Is that merely coincidental? Maybe the prompting of the Spirit is at work. When it comes to precognition, a lot of times we talk about that in terms of deja vu, right? Where you think you've dreamed something and now actually it's happening. On the other hand, there's also jamais vu, where you are convinced you're doing something for the first time that you've often done, actually. And a lot of scientists look at these as very concerning things. They can be indication of difficulties with the mind, because a lot of times those feelings are coming from the mind being convinced of a memory that may not actually be there, that may not actually be valid. And there are certain psychological conditions where you have a lot of deja vu that's actually showing a breakdown of certain things in the mind. On the other hand, God has provided experiences of precognition and retrocognition to his people. Elisha knew the plans of the king of Aram while he was in his bedroom, would have no other ability to do that in 2 Kings 6, verse 12. In Daniel 2, Daniel was told the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had when he was not there. And in Matthew 27:19, Pilate's wife suffers in a dream because of Jesus. And she warns Pilate about that the very next day. So we need to give some space for how God might communicate, and always, though, with a very healthy dose of skepticism, because we need to remember the limitations of our brains and the shortcuts that it often will take. When it comes to telemetry, those matters of auras and energies, a lot of that is really a lot of Western enthusiasm in the past 200 years, and maybe there's something to it. We can't be completely dogmatically sure that there isn't. There could be something to it. We might be ignorant of how it works. Maybe some people have discovered some things. We certainly get vibes. We can kind of feel energy in certain places. This shouldn't be terribly surprising as possible. After all, in Mark 5 verse 30, power came out of Jesus. There's spiritual power at work among his apostles in Acts 5 verse 12. That probably had something to do with some kind of energy, right? But just because it exists and we're not dogmatically against it doesn't mean that we should be manipulating those forces or trying to dabble in those forces, because God hasn't revealed a whole lot about them, and that should tell us something about them, that we should be very hesitant in trying to manipulate them. We don't know what we're getting ourselves into. There's benevolent spiritual energy in God through the Spirit. There could be malevolent energy out there as well. We don't want to be tapping into that malevolent energy. And that gets us also to paranormal phenomena. Because as Christians, we need to be open to the paranormal phenomena, because there is the spiritual realm out there. It's definitely paranormal. And according to the witness of Scripture, that there are times where whatever is veil, whatever's hindering us from understanding the paranormal world, the spiritual world around us, sometimes that veil will lift, and there will be these experiences of such things. So the magicians of Egypt were able to replicate some of the first plagues that Aaron and Moses provided, but they said that the gnats were the finger of God. The 1 Samuel 28, the necromancer of Endor conjures up that spirit of Saul. In 2 Kings 6, Elisha prays for his servant to see, and his servant all of a sudden sees chariots of fire all around them that he had not seen before, but had already been there. Now, it's easy for a lot of people to say, well, that's all just a bunch of hooligans, tomfoolery. God's making it up so people think it's something when it's not. It was a really, really strained explanation when the basic idea in the text is, yeah, these things exist. They are spiritual forces out there. The difference is that, sure, in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 4, an idol is nothing. But that doesn't mean that there's no spiritual force or spiritual power out there. Just because we don't understand these things doesn't mean they're not out there. Because in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 20, Paul also says that it would be like sacrificing to a demon. And so there are demonic forces at play that people are bowing down to. At no point in the Bible, either Old or New Testament, does God suggest there's nothing behind the magic and the necromancy and the sorcery going on. Instead, he tells them to avoid it, to have nothing to do with it. This is sorcery. These are things that you should not tolerate anybody among you living. Therefore, just like we recognize in our finite createdness that we might be able to sense the creation in ways beyond the five senses, so there are aspects of the creation that are normally beyond our perception, but sometimes we get a glimpse of reality that we really can't fully explain. It's one thing to recognize its existence, it's another thing to be dabbling in it. We need to not dabble in it. We must have nothing to do with it, lest we fall short and we end up falling prey to very ugly spiritual forces that are trying to actively harm us. And so what do we say about extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena? Well, it was a stated purpose of the advancers of the Enlightenment 250 years ago or so to banish the superstitious darkness of the ignorant masses with the light of knowledge according to reason. They've proven successful beyond their expectations. And we now live in a very post-Enlightenment, disenchanted age in which most people, most of the time, believe and accept what their senses perceive and nothing else, and dismiss it as impossible that anything else would exist. Not everyone views the creation this way. It would seem unthinkable to our ancient and medieval ancestors. Now, there are many ways in which our ancestors did live in very unhealthy forms of superstition that were very harmful to them. But perhaps now we've gone to the other extreme of scientific materialism, confident in only that which we can perceive through our senses, and that might be just as unfounded and just as unhealthy. In this disenchanting process, we might well have lost touch with ourselves and our environment in many very real and profound ways. And so we need to remember, at all times, there is more to the creation than we can perceive. If there is more to the creation than we can perceive, then there is a certainly strong possibility that we could be able to sense things in ways that do not directly involve our 5 explicit senses. And other times, our 5 explicit senses may be perceiving some glimpse of a spiritual realm or of some other dimension that we normally otherwise would not be able to perceive. Not everything we think is extrasensory perception or paranormal phenomena really is. We intuit a lot through instinct, experience, and through subconscious processing of what our 5 senses are actually perceiving. And a lot of times our brains aren't exactly entirely accurate. They don't entirely remember well, and we need to be careful about that. Not everything we might perceive with extrasensory ways or that are paranormal phenomena are good and healthy. The evil one and his demonic forces are at work, and they absolutely ensnare and catch people who are dabbling in many forms of dark mysticism. But we should still be open to the possibility of extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena. We should be critical and skeptical, but not always dismissive of what we might intuit or feel. We should be open to the promptings of God's Spirit, but testing those spirits so that we can avoid being influenced by the forces of evil. And in all things, we need to continue to trust in the Lord Jesus Christ and in His ways so we can obtain the resurrection of life in Him. I'm Ethan with the Venice Church of Christ. Very glad that you've joined us. Hope that you've benefited from a conversation about extrasensory perception and paranormal phenomena. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about it, please let us know in the comments. If we can be of any further service, please reach out to us at VeniceChurchOfChrist.org. We're now on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Threads, and YouTube. May the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.